It was almost daylight by the time they got it started, and you're going into the worst possible situation. You try not to have armor go through draws or files, and here is a wood on both sides, loaded with firepower. And we're leading into this absolute killing zone. To go into that gap the way we did, and it was just like shooting fish in a rain barrel.
The Canadian tanks were plowing through deep mud. We laid our gun on the leading tank, but by the time we were ready to fire, it had already been hit. And we swung our gun to another, but that too stopped. The third tank at which we aimed fired first. And the shell burst only yards in front of us. Quickly, we realigned our gun. The tank seemed to falter, and we fired.
We were just moving towards the position, and the incoming fire was such that you just could not exist there. To see these soldiers still trying to go forward and being hit is soul destroying.
While B Squadron takes a beating at the Hochwald Gap, A Squadron advances towards the rail embankment running through the village of Udom. It's the only piece of high ground in a sea of mud.
It was what they called a right hook to go around Udom and try and establish a front by the railway crossing. Supposedly the town looked pretty vacant, but all the time you don't take that for granted. Anything that moved, we were shooting it up. Terrible. It was a real effort to get to our objective. Then on top of it, we had the traps. If you fell into one of those, you were finished right there. And here we were coming out onto a dike area, and unknown to us, on either side of the dike were big, deep ditches. The way those tank ditches were designed, as you were coming around, you eventually lock onto one of those roads. That was a little piece of high ground from the mud, and so we probably chose to take that. And then when you get on it, then of course you can't get off it. And we just fell right in line. And that's the worst thing that could ever happen to an armored column. And they were just waiting for us. You know, we were sitting ducks.
The countryside near the German town of Udom shows little sign today of the ferocious battle that took place here. But during the final months of the Second World War, this quiet place was a battlefield. February 27th, 1945. Canadian Sherman tanks, avoiding minefields and mud, advance along a narrow dike, attempting to secure the railway embankment running through the town of Udom.
We just fell right in line. And that's the worst thing that could ever happen to an armored column, is to have your tanks one behind the other. The Germans had placed a lot of Tigers embedded down in the ground area, and anti-tank guns, and they were just waiting for us. Eddie, he was at the front, saw the Tiger, and I guess he knew that the Tiger was drawing a bead on him. Eddie loaded up an AP, and he shot that out. According to him, he says the shell just bounced right off its hide. And so he knew that he had to go to stage 2, which was get that opening.
The German Tiger is a 57-ton monster. It's built like a battleship, protected in places by more than 100 millimeters of steel plate. The Tiger seems indestructible, but it has a weak point. A narrow gap in its armor where the turret meets the hull. A shell strike there can put it out of action.
He did. He managed to jam the Tiger.
But it does no good. The Canadians are caught in a trap. The Germans have prepared a perfect ambush.
And it was just very fast. He just took out the front tank, back tank. He just took every other tank out. We were hit in the soft spot, like in the back. It was very abrupt, deafening, instant. Right off the bat, then you jump into action. It's like, you got to get out. You know that baby is burning. She's growing up. We were fortunate, managed to get out. Corporal McGivern looked and he saw the old girl was burning up pretty bad at the back end, so he says, we got to get out of here. And he looked over and he says, there's a farmhouse. He says, it's a short distance away. He says, we'll make a run for it.
They reach the farmhouse only to be captured. Trooper Gardner and his tank crew spend the final months of the war in a prison camp. They're the lucky ones. In the first 2 days of battle, hundreds of Canadian soldiers die, and hundreds more are wounded. Grim proof of the fierce defense put up by the Germans.
When you were there at the time, you didn't understand why they were fighting so hard. You didn't know why they were fighting. You didn't have time to understand what they were doing. All you knew is that they were fighting, and they weren't surrendering.
Each of these soldiers believed that each day they could hold their position, would help their country, because it was so close to the industrial center of the German Reich. Most of the war industry was there.
The army was fighting to prevent any enemy from entering the Fatherland. That's why we were fighting so hard.
On the morning of February 28, the Germans strike back at the Canadians' most vulnerable point, the Hochwald Gap. The Canadian tanks and infantry push into the gap and take ground near the western end. An advance force of Shermans moves forward to the midpoint in the gap. And the Germans pounce with Panther and Tiger tanks and self-propelled guns. Gunner David Marshall witnesses the attack.
Over the rise in front of us came the snout of 2 tanks, a Tiger and a Panther, heading our way. When our gunners had them in our sights, and before the German tanks could level out to bring their 88s down on us, our tanks opened fire, with all guns blazing.